3 steps that helped me get control over the strongest blur in Substance Designer and how it enhanced my creativity to make materials like this one. The first step is understanding the node internally. When I was making my brick wall material in Substance Designer, I came across the difficult decision of having to make the edges of my bricks. One of the main things that was really awkward was using the slow blur, and the main reason for that is because it always kind of destroyed my materials in the past. Every time I tried using the slow blur, it destroyed everything I touched. So I started to make myself a really important question. What if I understood how the node worked internally instead of just knowing the answer? What if I tried to understand what was actually happening inside visually instead of just going and reading the documentation? When you're studying in college or university, you're usually required to actually remember the answer instead of understanding it. And one of the main reasons is because the method of learning is quite old, and it's all about you remembering how to do things without the actual need of you understanding them. So I'm gonna make a really simple explanation to make a breakdown on how does this description help us understand the slow blur better. Think of your image like a drawing on a paper with a pencil, in this case as a square. Everything looks clean and sharp. Now picture yourself rubbing your finger over the pencil lines. They get smudged in certain directions. That is the effect the slow blur achieves, and it smudges your texture in the direction of another texture. Now let's take a better look inside Substance Designer so you can have a better understanding of how it works in real time. So right now we are inside Substance Designer. As you can see, I made a new graph and have other graphs in here that we're going to be looking into later for the rest of the video. So I'm going to create a shape node, as we said in the explanation, a square, and I'm going to create a slow blur, and I'm going to create, let's do a purling noise. So I'm going to connect this into my grayscale input, and I'm going to connect the rest to the purling noise. Right now, and this is one of the main reasons it's really hard to understand this node, everything looks super destroyed. So one of the main things you want to do is you want to increase the sample so you have more quality. But you can already start to see that if you zoom into this area, for example, and then we change to this, you see that the smudges, yes, or the deformation that we are causing to our shape is consistent with the image that we have. So let's make this a little bit easier to understand. Let's just actually go like this. Let's just try to do even better and make a little bit more contrast in here. See? And also lowering the intensity a little bit. You're gonna see that the areas, yes, where this is happening is due to the information that you have in the purling noise. Yes, this is going to be your slope map. Now this node has different modes, as you can see. Yes, they're basically doing the same, but they're doing it based on a specific number. Yes, the min mode looks for the minimum value in your image. Yeah, so it's looking for the minimum values in here. Yeah, so if I zoom in here, this is the minimum value it's getting. Yes, and it's pulling your edges inwards. If I go for the max, well, it's gonna be the opposite. It's gonna get the maximum values of the image and try to smudge your corners or edges of the shape away. Now for the blur, it's a combination of both things. It's actually doing both things at the same time. It's not taking nor the min or the maximum, it's just taking all the information from the image that we have here. Now this is a really small example, and the best case scenario to show you how to use this node is in a practical example that we're going to be looking at the end of the video. Step 2 is understanding when to use it. We are going to look into how to use the slow blur, but first we need to understand the situation we want to use this node. I'm talking about this specifically situation because, as many of you might think, the slow blur is something that everyone uses only to deform edges, but actually it has a lot of more applications on it. One of those applications I found while working as a professional was in cracks. I used the slow blur to give these cracks a little bit of a more organic look and realistic feeling to it. But the way I decided to use the slow blur into this specific problem is completely different to what I used to do in the past, and I know that many students have the same problem. So let me break this down. When I was learning Substance Designer, something that happened a lot was that professional launched a tutorial that everyone was happy about it. Everyone was excited about it because it showed you how to do something that before you couldn't see where to do it or how to do it. Yeah, in this case, let's take for example making rocks. In my case, I learned making rocks thanks to Javier Perez, who made an amazing tutorial about making rocks. But I had a problem. Every time I tried making those rocks, even by following a step-by-step tutorial and watching every single parameter he changed, I couldn't manage to get a good result in my material. And I always thought that was actually my fault, that I was not being good enough, or there was some parameter I was missing, or my settings were bad, or my computer were bad, or I was just a bad artist. And it happened a lot to me. And it also happened to many of my students nowadays, where they feel that they watch a tutorial, but when they want to do something new, they can't get that information into that area. What is happening there is that we are using nodes in specific situations that are kind of like defined as standard by professionals. Now, I'm not saying that they have any kind of fault into this, they just are showing you and sharing what they actually discovered, but we tend to use one specific thing for one specific moment, and that moment changes depending on the material we're working. So let me break this actually in a more simple way with a small story. Let's picture that we want to create, in this case, rocks. So in order to understand this better, let's actually picture our rocks as a problem that we want to solve, and that problem is a lock. So our rocks, yes, are this red lock, and the nodes, or the set of nodes that we're going to use to solve the problem of creating rocks, yes, is a key that we combine with the lock. What happens is that the lock, let me change the color, opens. Yeah, so now we can move forward to the next step. Now, what I used to do before, yes, is look for a key that someone else made before. Yes, so in this case, this key, I didn't make it. I took this key from a tutorial, let's say Javier Perez tutorial. Yeah, so in Javier Perez tutorial, I saw the problem of creating rocks, and then he generated a key. So I made a test and realized that this worked. So what I did next is I tried this key, the key that we have here, I tried with my lock, with my material where I have rocks as well. So I came in here and tried doing this. And what happened is that I didn't solve the problem. My rocks look really bad. That means my locks was still closed. I wasn't able to open this lock with the key. And I hope and I think that you are already understanding where I'm going. The issue here is that I am trying to open my lock with the key of another lock. In a more, let's say, specific way of saying, I'm trying to solve one problem with the solution of another problem. Despite these two problems might look similar, they are different. Yes, we see them as similar, but inside they are quite different. That's why this first lock is red and the second one is green. Now, for my cracks, I didn't do this. I actually made something different. I made my own key. So instead of copying this key and just inserting it into my lock, I made a new one. But the way I did it is different. I actually got all of this information, all of this key, saw what results it gave me, and then I adjusted so it could fit my lock. So now I have a key that, if I mix them together in here, it gives me the lock and lock. I know that this is a lot of theory. We're gonna get into Substance Designer in some minutes, but I just want to break down exactly what I did with my cracks in a more specific way so that you could understand better. I first start about breaking down the problem that was having. I was trying to have cracks that feel original and also organic. So I wanted to generate a feeling. My problem was that I wanted to generate a feeling of organicness in my cracks. What I thought after was, how would these cracks feel organic? Not what nodes would I use, but how would they look if they felt organic? It was then when I thought about, okay, so some cracks go in and out. They have areas where they're really small, but then they open out because they have like bigger areas or broken areas. Yes, and they have a little bit of slope. So I would need something that will kind of like shrink my cracks at the same time that they open up and they have a small bevel to get that slope. Out of this process of thinking, I came out with different nodes, not only the slope blur, I came up with warps, non-uniform directional warps, multi-directional warps, slope blurs, and even non-uniform blurs. And what I did after was I started testing out, I started to build my key. And at the moment, I realized I had built my key because it just worked. It clicked. I created the key, I tested, it didn't work. I recreated again, I tested, and it worked. Now, to make this easier for you and understand, I'm gonna make a small list. I thought about the feeling or change I wanted to bring. So, in regards, I thought about the problem. Then I pictured how I wanted to achieve it, and after that, the last step was actually breaking it down into separate steps and test what was going on. Despite I already gave you my method to actually understand when to use a node or how or which nodes to use, I now want to give you specific situations where you can use the slope blur that we are going to be looking into in the next step. The slope blur is really great at deforming shapes, so it can be really easy to use in hard surface edges where we want a little bit of chipping or even mass warping. We're going to look into many of these warpings and blendings and how to make these more organic in some seconds. Organic noise patterns are also on something slow blurs are really great on. If you watch one of my latest videos, you're gonna see that I use it to create rocks and generate some rocky feeling over them, and we're gonna be looking into them as well today. And finally, something that you might have seen recently is leaks. Slow blur is really great at making leaks, and despite of what you think, it's not gonna be the final step to making leaks, but it's gonna be somewhat in the middle, like a tool that is gonna help us get there. Step 3, and is the one I know you might have been waiting for, is how to use the slow blur and not break your materials. And for this part, we're going to be looking into 3 graphs and 3 different materials and the scenarios where we are using the slow blur and how do we use it. So let's start with number 1. Bricks. Now this spaghetti salad that you are seeing right here, guys, is the graph for this material that you see on screen. Now this file is actually quite heavy, and as you can see, the bricks look really great in shape if we go in, and even without color we are actually seeing a lot of detail. So let's take a look at this part here where the mess starts. So as you can see, I started by creating a brick pattern. We're going to talk about brick patterns later, but if you want to learn more about them, I already have a video that you can get into in my profile of YouTube. So in this salad that you see here, we have the edge shipping, and yes, it's quite disorganized because once I finished this project, I basically never went back to it. So you can see that there are some weird combinations in here. So let me show you a little bit of them and some tricks. So one of the first combinations we're gonna do is with a purling noise, yeah? And some of these nodes might take some time to kind of like load, but let's just take this as an example and create a new purling noise, yeah? As we saw before, the purling noise basically kind of like deforms our shape. See? And usually, as a beginner, what usually happens to me a lot was this. I got super strong and deformed details in my shapes, and in my students' work it happens also a lot because we are used to use really common values. Yes, values between 0.1 and 1, and these values are actually quite strong. If you look at the values I'm using in these nodes, I'm using a value that is super low. I mean, it's 0.0015. Yeah, it's a really low value. So if you want to play with your edges and make them look realistic without breaking them, you need to go really low on them. And there's some also ways of making this detail not that strong. Something that many of you just start with is a clouds 2. The clouds 2 would usually break these really hard. So there's 2 things you can do. First is lower the intensity, but we're not gonna look into that because we already saw that. We're gonna go and blur this. Yeah, I'm gonna remove the blurring here, connect it to my slope, and nothing will change. But when I start increasing the blur, see how the shape starts to relax? That, my friends, is a really great way, and the second way to control the intensity of your parameters in here. Now, another trick I wanted to show you is actually how I started building and how I choose all of these maps. So the first thing is that I choose the clouds 2 in here, and I make it tiled a lot, and I blur it a lot with a really low intensity, because what I was looking for was for a warping. Yes, you can see a change here, a small, really small warping that then would start to kind of like make bigger and more intense. Yeah, that's why we are using a blurring here, because we want it to be less intense. Now take a look at this. If you realize I'm using exactly the same slow blur with a more intense parameter in here and combining them in different blend nodes. The reason for this is that by doing something like what you're seeing right now on screen, you are allowing yourself to make more variation with more detail and control. If I have this example, yes, and then I have this other example that has 2 times the power, yes, this one is way stronger than this one. And if I want to do variation, the only thing I need to do is blend them together here, get an appropriate mask, and then combine them in the opacity. And now I went from this that is super strong to this that is a little bit more controlled. Yes, and this is a great way of doing edges for your brick patterns, tile patterns, you name it. Yeah. Now, in here, as I was saying before, we're using the blur, so the deformation is actually quite soft and smudgy. But we can actually use maps as, for example, the black and white spots too, to make more sharp details. See how we go from this to this? Yeah. But again, look, the intensity I'm using. The more sharp is going to be the image that you're going to get into your slope input, the less it will have to be the intensity of in your slope blur node. So remember about that. If we have a blur image, you're going to most probably have to use a more high value. If you have a really sharp image, then you're going to need to start using lower values. And when I mean lower values, I mean values below 0.01. Yes, remember we have like at least 3 zeros after a comma in here. Now I don't want to get that much into details with all the edges of this brick wall because it's not the focus of these videos, and I'm actually thinking of making a new chapter for this particularly, where we're going to be looking into all the details of these bricks that you see here. Now the second situation we're going to look into is in rock formations to create different noises. Now in here you're not going to be able to see it that much. Oh, there it load the color. Now you might be able to see it, but all these big rock layerings areas that you see in here are the ones that I am generating using the slow blur. The process is actually quite simple. I got a cells pattern 1, I invert this, and using a directional warp with a basically blurred clouds 2, I made this deformation. And then I used a slow blur using the actual clouds 2 to create this kind of crystal effect. Now, as I said before, don't use the slow blur only for these situations, start to explore with them. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that later because you're going to discover, yes, results like these ones that might be useful for you. Yes, more in the future. You can do a lot of things with this. In fact, if we get a dirt node in here, for example, a dirt node, and we make a blur in here, combine them like this, you're going to start to create these trails that look so good and amazing. Yes, this seems a little bit weird, but you can actually use it somewhere else. Like, let's see if and let's make an experiment here now live. Let's see if by actually getting the shape of the rocks as the source for the slope, yes, look, we can create the same effect but around the stones that we are making, and we can go in to make these inwards and create these kind of spots as well. So as you can see, the slow blur is actually useful for many things, yeah, and for rocks as well is super great. Not only in this area where we are actually generating this kind of like grungy effect. Yes, it can deform a lot of things. We can actually use it in this area here. Yeah, for example, if I were to do a slow blur, yeah, here, and I will get the samples at maximum and set this in min because I want to take my edges inwards. And I'm gonna connect this here, and it's gonna be super intense now, but I'm gonna lower this down a little bit. Now, the other problem we have here, that is a common problem that you usually have, is that this clouds 2 is too big. So what you do is you come in here and you scale this down because you want smaller details, yeah? And then we're gonna do the same as we did with the bricks, yes? And we're gonna get a Gaussian spots, yeah? I'm gonna use it as a mask. So now we have certain areas with these kind of like broken parts, and let's see if by using this again, yes, it's gonna just broke up. So let's use a threshold, but I think this should be also quite enough for what we're gonna do, yeah. Now we went from this to this, having more variation in here, see? And I can even make it better or worse, depending what I choose to do. But you can already see that we add some variation in some of these rocks as I was expecting. So let's go to the last one, the leaks. Leaks are one of the things that most material artists do quite a lot, and we always kind of tend or follow to use the actual leaks that we have inside Substance Designer. Grunge leak paints, and usually that's because we are tired of making leaks, so basically we just reuse what we have in there because it already works. But for this material, I made a new set of leaks. I made some leaks that feel more realistic and more kind of like wet. And in here, you can see the result of that process. So we're gonna go onto in here. I'm gonna break down all of this process. So first, we started with some directional scratches. Yes, we need the directional scratches. They are the body and the soul to what we're gonna be doing with the leaks. Now, we want these directional scratches because we want to be able to actually change the direction of these ones. Yeah. It's gonna be really depending a lot, yes, but you can see that it's completely procedural and works quite well. Now, from these directional scratches that we are using a slow amount of pattern because we need the spaces between the leaks, yes, for them to be understandable. If I start doing this, you're not gonna understand that they are leaks, but if I leave a space in between them, you are. Then we do use a multi-directional warp with a clouds 2. Why do we use a multi-directional warp and not a directional warp? If I were to use a directional warp in this situation, what's gonna happen is that I'm gonna just deform everything and I'm gonna just have the same amount of lines. In this case, the multi-directional warp is doing kind of like a scribble because it's doing it in 4 directions, yeah? So So it's grabbing one pixel or one shape and it's doing this warp or deformation in 4 directions. So it kind of like adds a more kind of like blurred version of the lines and also kind of more organic feeling. And I do really not care about how they're looking right now because later I'm gonna make them look better. How? I use a blur, yes, and this blur is for expanding the pixels so then with the levels I can finish that work and bring that value up. Yeah, and once we have this, we are gonna use the slow blur. Why the slow blur? Because we are expanding our shapes so they get to touch each other. See how we go from this to this? These are the lines that I was looking for. Yeah, and again, we can change the blending mode to have different results, as you can see here. Now, I don't think that the max is gonna actually change much from the blur, but the min mode, it's gonna change a little bit the result. I'm not sure how good they will look with this. They feel a little bit different, but we're gonna see it. Actually, let's just get this here and look for where I did it here and connect this and this and make a change. I wanna see how they look. Okay, so it's just basically the same. It makes them a little bit thinner. I do like my original ones though. So now that we have this is actually quite sharp information. And as I told you before, we are not going to use the slow blur as the solution to our problem, but as another step that we have in our ladder to get to the actual result that we want. But these are the leaks. So we use a non-uniform blur with itself with an intensity of 8.66. And we lower the samples. If I were to increase the sample, what's gonna happen is that it's gonna lose a little bit of play. Yes, it's gonna lose a little bit of shape, as you can see here. I wanted to keep, yes, the shapes. The non-uniform blur, what it does, it blurs everything starting from the edges of your images and it leaves the center a little bit less untouched. So if I were to actually start increasing the intensity of this, you're gonna see that the first area that are gonna disappear are the edges and then they start to blur more these areas. Yeah, of course, if I land this, see the most strongest parts are gonna be these ones. Yeah, now again, if we pull this in, it's not gonna be exactly the same. Yeah, so we need a good shape and also a place where to test it. Now finally, we're going to use a non-uniform directional warp to generate this variation. Now this variation is not that important for the color itself, as you can see, because there's actually not here, but it's going to be really important later for a mask or for a roughness map. Yeah, even if we want to add more details to this, we could actually use this at our advantage. Now we need a way to control this, and it's actually quite simple for this kind of material. We're gonna get a gradient linear one, and we're gonna get a gradient map, and you're gonna get this part, and you're gonna start to control how long our leaks are gonna go over our material. Yes, now I have them around here, and what I did, I multiplied them together and connect this into the opacity of a gray color that is being blended on top. And that's how you get your leaks for your material. Now, all the things that you saw today are gonna help you get better at using the slow blur. I hope I did a great job for you and that you are able to understand it better. However, I do want to ask you to please go over step 2. Despite I told you that step 3 is one that you're really gonna need, step 2 is the one that you really want to apply to every node. Yeah, this is a slow blur video. I wasn't able to make something more focused on that, but I do want to understand that you shouldn't sacrifice your creativity because of what a professional says. I'm trying to open your mind so that you can actually build new things and be more creative and have more control over all the things that you do. And most of the time, you're not able to do it because you're just following someone else's work. And you need to be brave enough to start following your own work. And the starting point of that is failing, doing things that don't work, because eventually you're gonna get to the things that work. That's how it always works. There's no magic guide for this. There's no Bible to learn every single thing. The only difference between a professional and you is that professionals know this and they don't give up. They do it even when they don't feel like doing it, and they get the results because they don't stop trying. However, if you still feel you need more tutorials and more guidance to actually get into Substance Designer and learn more about the software, I have a full tutorial in my YouTube channel for creating cobblestones, and it's quite a really great tutorial to start with organic shapes. It's separate in different videos, but it's going to be super useful for you. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.